Good evening, everyone. My name is Frank Grumbine. I'm the Historic Preservation Specialist and Archivist for the City of Harrisburg. The purpose of tonight's public discussion is to formally introduce the City of Harrisburg's new 2021 Historic District Design and Preservation Guidelines. This is the first of two meetings. The second meeting will occur next Thursday at the same time. The first meeting tonight will outline the first half of the document, and then the second meeting will outline the second half of the document. So I'll begin with so what are the historic district guidelines? So the existing historic district guidelines have existed and were adopted in 2009. But overall, the guidelines are a technical guide which outline the recommended procedures and methods to preserve historic architecture and streetscapes in the city of Harrisburg. The appropriateness of changes in historic districts can often be subjective without delineated standards, and these design guidelines standardize the recommended procedures based on historic preservation practices, thus making these decisions more objective and grounded in reason. The guidelines further outline the city's historic district regulations and give guidance on how to navigate HARB in the application process, HARB being the Harrisburg Architectural Review Board. The purpose of the guidelines is to provide this comprehensive information regarding Harrisburg's local history and architecture, as well as providing specific guidelines for appropriate maintenance, rehabilitation, and improvements that preserve and enhance the character and appearance of the city's historic buildings and neighborhoods. What is the purpose of updating these guidelines? Like I've said, the existing guidelines are from 2009, so they've become a little outdated, but still relevant. So the current guidelines are not particularly specific enough about recommended methods of preservation, and the existing guidelines have too many generalizations about historic preservation, and not fully considering the context of projects and architectural change. So the new guidelines are more specific, more in depth, but also trying to be a little bit simplified in terms of cutting out the architectural language and being more relatable, I guess. Additionally, the new guidelines provide specific answers to questions regarding historic preservation and historic district regulations. And lastly, updating the historic district guidelines is an investment into the city's historic preservation program, and is an outward investment into providing residents with the most relevant information for historic district regulations. So let me try to share my screen here so I can share the document here.
Hey Frank, I've gone ahead and shared it if you like.
Thanks, Moen. I was having trouble trying to figure that out. Sorry. So Momen's going to help me out. I apologize for that. So I'll go over the first chapter briefly. Chapter 1 is a historical overview of the city of Harrisburg and its history. Overall, this provides historical context for identifying the uniqueness of each neighborhood and their change over time. This chapter is fairly brief in the existing guidelines, not this version, but I felt it was necessary to provide more historical context, to provide a more extensive information about the city's history and how this relates between the past and the present, and what this connection is to our existing built environment. It's important to understand the narrative of the history of Harrisburg and its evolution, and how building materials and building styles and and the uniqueness of Harrisburg and its contribution to greater Pennsylvania and American history, and why these neighborhoods are unique and special. So generally, it just provides a historical context to understand why our neighborhoods are important. I'll move on to the second chapter, and thanks, Momin. The second chapter, as you can see, is architectural styles. Like the existing guidelines, this section or chapter rather is essentially the same. Just updated photos, updated descriptions of architectural styles. Not a whole lot has changed. Like I just said, it contains most of the same information as the existing guidelines. This is just a reference for people who are interested in trying to identify the type of building they own, and sometimes this is not exactly the easiest thing, because a lot of types of architecture blend various styles and various features of many types of architectural styles. And I'd like to say that the majority of Harrisburg City, the majority of the city's housing stock, in particularly the municipal historic districts, were constructed in the late 19th to early 20th centuries, so around between 1870 to 1920. This is a rough estimate of the building stock that exists in the historic districts. Obviously, there are buildings far older and far newer. But this is the bulk of the building stock that exists in our municipal historic districts. And these are just brief descriptions of these chapters, especially the ones that haven't changed a whole lot. And I'll spend more time on the chapters that have more substantial information. Chapter 3. This chapter is important. The historic preservation planning. So this chapter outlines each of the municipal historic districts and the architectural conservation overlay district of our local historic preservation program. Overall, this chapter has been simplified from the existing historic district design guidelines. I felt that the existing guidelines were a bit convoluted and somewhat difficult to understand, because if you don't do this every day, it becomes difficult to understand, the difference between municipal historic districts, national historic districts, what's protected, what's not protected, what policies impact each of these types of historic districts or particular cultural resources. So municipal historic districts are those that are protected under local municipal ordinance. These are the districts that are regulated by the city's planning bureau and the city's historic or Harrisburg Architectural Review Board. These are the ones that this document it pertains to. The national historic districts I'm sorry, I lost my place here. National historic districts are regulated by both the state and federal government, mostly the Department of Interior, the Secretary of the Interior, and the National Park Service, and the State Historic Preservation Office. These national historic districts are not regulated by the city of Harrisburg. If you own a property that's located in a municipal historic district and a national historic district, HARB regulations and historic district regulations do apply to your property under the city historic district ordinance. It's easy to get those mixed up if, like I said, if you don't do this every day. But this document solely pertains to the municipal historic districts and architectural conservation overlay districts. And the difference between the ACOD, Conservation Overlay District, and Municipal Historic District is that the Conservation Overlay District, Architectural Conservation Overlay District, is a little less strenuous in its regulations, I should say. It's a little more lenient in what's allowable and what's appropriate. But a lot of these guidelines still apply to the ACOD. And the only ACOD is Summit Terrace, whereas that we have 6 municipal historic districts. Allison Hill is the smallest district. Harrisburg Historic District, right downtown. Shipoke, of course. Midtown, Uptown, which is our largest district, and Fox Ridge. So these are municipal historic districts, which are regulated under our local historic district ordinance, and exterior alterations visible from public rights of ways, sidewalks, roads, alleys, are subject to these guidelines. So that's about sums up chapter 3. It's just an overview of, like I said, overview of local historic preservation planning. There's a map of each district in this chapter. I'll move on to chapter 4. I'm sorry, this feels like I'm moving really fast, but it's a pretty long document. So and there's sorry, Moment, I'm having you skip around. So that last map was the National Historic District map. So we have quite a few national historic districts, and these national historic districts are not regulated by the HARB or these historic district guidelines, but they do overlap municipal historic districts. So municipal historic districts exist within national historic districts, but they they're not the same. So I'll move on to chapter 4. So chapter 4 is application and HARB review. So this chapter has much more information than the existing guidelines. This is kind of a technical bureaucratic kind of a chapter. So I tried to make it as simple as possible, the simplest way to understand. So bear with me. This chapter has been expanded to elaborate on the type of work that can be approved in historic districts, how HARB and the Planning Bureau make decisions, and information on how these decisions are made. This chapter is one of the most important chapters as it explains how to navigate the HARB process. So I added to this chapter determination of visibility. I thought this was important because the Planning Bureau and the city get a lot of questions about what is regulated by the historic districts, and it's always, if it's visible from a public right of way, it's regulated by the historic district. And then I added this project review guide. There's 3 steps: repair, replace in kind, or change, remove, or alter. Repair usually doesn't need review by either the Planning Bureau, depending on the scope of the repair. This is usually repairing something in kind, something simple like a floorboard or a baluster in kind, something that doesn't necessarily need a building permit. And step 2 is replace in kind. This type of repair or work is administratively approved by the Planning Bureau. This is like an in-kind replacement of a porch floor, or an in-kind replacement of a window, a wood window. And then finally, step three is change, remove, or alter. This is the step that requires hard review. It's changing window types, changing roof types, or removing doors, removing windows, filling them in, having a new addition to a property, removing an addition, things like that. Big scale kind of projects, but also some small scale things can fall into this category too, such as removing a single window from a double hung to a picture window would have to be reviewed by HARB. So this is not a comprehensive guide on this page for what project review, but nonetheless, it provides a guideline of how your project should proceed. Additionally, the HARB review process outlines the HARB review process, the Harrisburg Architectural Review Board process. You submit your certificate of appropriateness application. The Planning Bureau reviews it. It's reviewed by HARB. HARB approves or denies it. City Council reviews the approval or denial. And if your project is denied, you have the ability to appeal that decision or to City Council, where HARB is an advisory committee to City Council. So City Council has the final say in whether or not your project is approved or denied. And the big section that I added to this chapter is determination of appropriateness. So I felt this was necessary for both transparency and largely transparency, showing what the process is and how the HARB and the Planning Bureau determine what projects are appropriate and what projects are inappropriate for historic districts. I think it's like 2 pages down, Momin, sorry. There it is. So the HARB and the Planning Bureau determine what's appropriate through these documents and these methods. The first is the Secretary of Interior standards for the treatment of historic properties. So this is the de facto guidelines from the Department of Interior and the National Park Service for how one should go about preserving, repairing, or replacing in kind elements or architectural features on historic buildings, historic landscapes, and things like that. So that's the primary guideline that the HARB and the Planning Bureau use to determine whether or not a project is appropriate. The second aspect of how a project is determined appropriate is this document, the Historic District Guidelines. This is kind of a sister document at the local level to the Secretary of Interior standards. So the guidelines that exist in this document advise HARB and the Planning Bureau whether or not your project is appropriate. Third are the National Park Service and Preservation Briefs. These are technical guides provided by the Secretary of Interior and the National Park Service on how to preserve and the methods in which how to maintain and replace in kind architectural elements on historic buildings. The fourth aspect is the hierarchy of facades. So obviously the primary facade of a historic building is almost always more important than a rear facade or a facade that's not wholly visible from a public right-of-way. So this is taken in the context based on the project and the context of the project. 5, this is a classification of historic buildings. So your building has kind of like a grade of how significant it is in its context. I won't get into the nitty gritty of this. It's a little esoteric, but A, B, C, and D. A is the best grade. Your building has national, state, international importance, and D, the building has little or no architectural or historic importance. And this can be a bit subjective based on what documentation the Planning Bureau has, what information, historical primary sources we have to review. So we work with what we have, and we make a determination on the information that we have at the time a determination is made. And the last part of determination of appropriateness is the context of the building or the context of the site. And this is one of the biggest things. What is the context of the project within the greater historic district and the neighborhood itself? Is it appropriate for the block? Is it appropriate for the historic district? How visible is it? What's the relationship of the project to the building and to the block and to the neighborhood itself? So the context of a project in its environment and its built environment is largely significant, and it is one of the primary purposes of why historic districts exist, is to preserve not only a single building or a block of buildings, but it's a collection of buildings in a neighborhood that's significant and contributing to the character of Harrisburg. Moving on to, moving on to chapter 5. So the building maintenance and rehabilitation is the largest and the most functional purpose of the design guidelines. This chapter and its many subsections elaborate on historic materials, architectural features, how to maintain, preserve, and repair these architectural elements. The general information in this chapter is largely the same as the existing guidelines, but is expanded in a way that is more thoroughly explained, and what materials and methods are appropriate and inappropriate for rehabilitation for historic properties. Largely, this chapter emphasizes for each subsection repair rather than replace. In contemporary America, we've come to we've developed a culture where we feel the need to replace rather than repair everything because materials have gotten cheaper, craftsmanship. There aren't as many craftsmen available to perform specific types of work. So that's why it's important to emphasize repair over replace, because once these materials are gone and missing, they're gone forever. So furthermore, this chapter is greatly expanded to outline why these methods are appropriate and how they impact the historic district. Each subsection includes approved and allowable materials and why they are approved and why are they not approved. Historic and contemporary material types are discussed in each of the sections of this chapter as well. Rather than going through each of these subsections, I'll briefly explain each of the subsections and the purpose of each subsection. So the first section is siding and exterior wooden details. No other feature could likely be considered more important than the exterior walls. The majority of Harrisburg's historic buildings have brick exterior, while a lesser number use stone and wood clapboard. As you could see on the screen, there are other types of historic materials that have been applied over the years, but the majority are brick or wood clapboard generally. Protecting and maintaining the exterior of a building is always recommended, and doing so will enhance the appearance of the property, maintain property value, and prevent extensive deterioration. The next section outline, and like I said, the majority of this chapter is largely the same as the existing guidelines, but it's just formatted differently. It includes more information about our particular historical architectural trends, what the context of these trends are in American architectural history, and whether or not these trends reflect the building's architectural values in historic preservation. A lot of contemporary materials such as vinyl siding, aluminum siding, even formstone in the earlier 20th century are not historically contextual to most of the buildings. So it's important to understand when your building was constructed, the materials that would have been prevalent at that time of construction, and excuse me, and what type of materials are historically appropriate for your building. And that's why it's important to maintain the existing historic materials, so the continuity of historical change is understood. The next the next subsection of this chapter is masonry. Harrisburg has a lot of masonry building stock, mostly brick, and it's important to understand that masonry comes in all shapes and sizes. It was all constructed or manufactured differently or quarried differently. So understanding the complexities of masonry and how to maintain, preserve, and repair masonry is the first step into understanding why it's so critical to repair it and preserve it. So masonry in Harrisburg, like I said, was usually brick, but other types of masonry such as granite, limestone, brownstone, marble, cast stone, and stucco were used, as well as other types of masonry. Historic masonry should be identified, retained, and preserved. The various differences of mortar, including its color, joint size, hardness, and style, also need to be considered when planning your rehabilitation or preservation of historic masonry. And like I said, masonry comes in all different types of stone, types of brick. They're all made differently with different natural materials. And the most common issue that I see with masonry is, excuse me, the most common issue is that people repoint historic brick with Portland based mortar, which is inappropriate because the Portland based mortar will eventually damage the historic brick and make it spall because the moisture cannot penetrate through the mortar joints. It penetrates back through the brick and then causes damage in the future. I'll move on to the next subsection, which is roofing. A lot of roofing work happens, obviously, in a densely populated area such as the city of Harrisburg. So it's important to maintain. It's important to maintain the distinctive styles and materials and functional character-defining features of historic roofs. There are many styles of roofs in Harrisburg's historic districts and are composed of various types of materials, including wood, metal, slate, tile, and of course, asphalt shingles. Maintenance of historic roofs is critical to protect the rest of the building from unnecessary deterioration. Without a sound structural roof, everything below it is compromised from precipitation and from other environmental concerns. Depending on the type of roof and its materials, preservation methods vary greatly. So, and the most important thing about roofs is, just inspecting it, making sure that the roof is not leaking. Getting in the attic or the top level of the building. Ensuring that there aren't any leaks, isn't any mold or deterioration or rot in the roof. The most common roof materials in Harrisburg, in the historic districts, are generally slate and metal. Slate is often a character defining features on Second Empire style buildings with the mansard roofs that are so prominent in many of our historic districts. So it's important to maintain that texture and those materials on these roofs because they're largely character defining, and they provide a sense of character to the neighborhood, as well as contributing to the overall well-being of a neighborhood through continuity, through architectural continuity. Italianate style houses or buildings generally have flat roofs. Almost always have flat roofs. So the roofs on these types of buildings are almost always not visible from a public right of way. And roof replacements on these types of buildings are usually administratively approved because they're flat, and the roof replacement doesn't involve the cornice, or doesn't affect other architectural features of a building. So those are usually fairly simple in terms of approval. I'll move on to the next subsection as metals. Architectural metals such as cast iron, wrought iron, copper, tin, sheet metal, aluminum, steel, lead, zinc, brass, and bronze are traditional architectural metals in Harrisburg's historic districts. It's essential to preserve these metals for their distinctive characters and qualities. Not to mention, it's expensive to replicate these materials. So the maintenance and preservation of existing historic architectural metals is essential for the long-term preservation of them. Typical architectural metal features include fences, gates, columns, balustrades, gutters, downspouts, roofs, cast iron fences, copper bay windows, cornices, roof cresting, doors, and so on. Usually they're highly decorative, either cast iron or wrought iron. Both contribute greatly to the historic architectural elements of a historic district. Oftentimes, it's one of the most character defining features because people are in such awe of the great detail and decoration that a lot of historic architectural metal features have. Highly skilled artisans often created historic metal building components, and they still do today. But a lot of times, a lot of features, like I said, were cast iron and then preserved through a cyclical maintenance, such as painting. The next subsection is windows. Windows are a hot button issue in historic preservation, and for good reason. Windows are some of the most character defining features of historic buildings. If a building had eyes, it would be its windows. And that's, usually where people's first impression of a building is through its windows. They're not only a decorative part of a building's architecture, but are functional aspects of the architecture of buildings. Windows provide light and ventilation that make the interior of a property more valuable and useful. It is important to identify, retain, and preserve historic windows whenever and wherever possible. Their materials, craftsmanship, designs, and unique details make them important character-defining features. The window pattern, size, shape, style, and location have a substantial effect on the architectural uh, characteristics of a building and the overall streetscape. Changes to historic windows or their openings, particularly on primary facades, have, like I said, dramatic effects on the outward appearance of a building and ultimately disrupts the rhythm and continuity of window patterns on a streetscape. um, so Windows, the Harb is always looking at new window products and window materials. They are open to high quality window products. With that being said, vinyl windows are largely not appropriate for use in historic districts or historic buildings because they are not historically contextual and contrary to marketing campaigns, they do not last a lifetime. I would argue many historic preservationists would argue that wood windows last much closer to a lifetime than vinyl windows do if properly maintained. Um, so a lot of these sub chapters have examples of inappropriate windows and appropriate windows, criteria of how to go about replacing windows, criteria to understand when looking at new products. The next subsection I'll briefly discuss are doors and entrances. Doors and entrances are made up of many parts, but not only the door, and are made up of brackets, transom, windows, light fixtures, and hardware. Of these elements, the combined great grand historic entrances that should always be preserved and are typically not found in modern construction. It's important to maintain door surrounds and historic doors because it's the portal to a historic building. It's the first experience you have when entering a historic space or a historic building, and it's your first impression of how of not of a homeowner's experience in living in a historic district. Culturally, it's significant of how you enter and leave your house. So it's really important to preserve door surrounds, transoms, and historic doors. Doors are often replaced in historic districts, not always, legally, I guess. And a lot of the times, historic doors have been replaced with steel doors, which are not appropriate for use in historic districts. And and if a door replacement is necessary, usually wood is the most appropriate option for door replacement in historic districts. But this is based on the context of the property, the location of it, what the existing door material is, and so on. So there's a lot of variables that go into making decisions about what is appropriate and what's not appropriate. The next subsection are porches. Porches are one of my favorite architectural features of historic buildings because they engage both the residents of the building and the visitors. Visitors, engage with historic buildings by peering into their historic porches and interpreting, the architectural features of a historic porch and the continuity of historic porches on a streetscape. Porches are largely exposed to the elements, which is why many times you'll see them in disrepair. Many times they've been removed entirely, and oftentimes they have been altered. A lot of their historic architectural features have been altered to the point where they have no integrity anymore. So, porches are generally maintenance heavy. So it's important to, do an annual inspection on the function and the state of a historic porch. Is there any rot? Is there debris buildup on a porch? This kind of basic, maintenance upkeep is generally the rule on historic porches. Um, So I'll try to get a couple more of these in before we open up for public comment and questions. I didn't think I would take this much time, but I apologize. The next subsection of this chapter is signs and awnings. Signs and awnings are a little different than the rest of rehabilitation and maintenance. Usually there aren't too many historic signs left in the city, and when they are, obviously it should be preserved and repaired as necessary. But usually HARB reviews the erection of new signs, so it's appropriate to understand how new signs and awnings relate to the context of the building and the context of the neighborhood. So signs are usually signs should be come in varieties and sizes and shapes to add texture and character to a streetscape. So there aren't super definitive guidelines for what signs are appropriate, because this is variable, because one sign is appropriate for one building, whereas it would not be appropriate for another building. So then there are guidelines for sign materials, sign locations, mounting, what type of sign design is appropriate for a building. So all those kind of aspects of signs and awnings are outlined in this subchapter. The next subchapter are storefronts. Commercial storefronts are common throughout Harrisburg neighborhoods and historic districts. Commercial buildings were often on in commercial buildings, residential dwellings existed on the second and third floors, whereas commercial storefronts existed on the first floors. It's important to maintain historic storefronts because they are highly decorative, and they have a great impact on economic vitality of a neighborhood. And if you see a historic storefront, it draws you to it. They're beautiful. There's not a better way to say it. They have such character, and they define a downtown or a commercial area to the point where that's the primary memory you have when you visit a downtown, are the storefronts. That's how you engage with these buildings. I think I'll stop there for now and open up for comments and questions before I get too far ahead of myself, and maybe save the rest for the next meeting. So I guess at this point I'll open it up. If Trina, the HARB chair, has any comments or questions, I'll let her speak, and then open it up for comments or questions.
Sure. Hi, I'm Trina Gribble, Chair of the Historic Architecture Review Board, and there I am. Just wanted to say thank you very much, Frank, and the Planning Bureau for putting this document together. I know the Historic Architectural Review Board started a kickoff of this effort. I think it was fall of 2019.
October, yep.
Yeah, October. Obviously before COVID, and we had a presentation over at the Historic Harrisburg Association building, Resource Center, to gather public input and get initial feedback on what we could do to improve our education of what historic preservation means, and also how we can update these guidelines. So again, it was an effort by all HARB members to kind of take a section of the existing guidelines and put some updates in there, and then discuss it. But the most tasked with it was Frank, for actually putting all those pieces together and creating a functional document. So we hope it's helpful going forward to everyone to use the guidelines as you do any preservation projects or any projects in the historic districts. And we hope that this presentation tonight and the next one are helpful in giving an initial orientation of how to navigate through the document. So with that, I guess we'll take some questions, right, Frank?
Yep, that sounds good. We'll take some questions or comments if there are any.
For anyone that's interested in saying any comments or asking any questions, please use the raise hand tool, and we'll go ahead and unmute you. I also want to recognize Councilwoman Bowers, who has also, she is here as well. All right, I don't see any hands raised.
Okay.
Oh, actually, 1 second, I see Loretta Barbidare.
Yep.
Sorry if I mispronounced your name. I'll go ahead and unmute you and go ahead.
Thank you so much. I thought Councilwoman Bowers was going to speak, so I didn't want to put up my hand prematurely. This is absolutely awesome. Now, of course, I have the previous copy that you used to work off of this, and it's wonderful. My question, if you could just explain, it kind of went over my head quickly. I was writing notes on something else. The difference between going back to chapter 3, okay, the municipal, the ACOD, and the National Register. Did you say that the historic districts that on the National Register that overlap our Harrisburg municipal districts have like, they supersede anything that we would want to do?
So municipal, so I know it's confusing. So municipal historic districts are independent of national historic districts, but they overlap because they have a lot of the same characteristics that make them qualify for each type of district. So municipal historic districts have a greater protection from the city of Harrisburg and the HARB and the Planning Bureau, and preserving their architectural features, whereas national historic districts don't have this type of protection from a local municipality such as the city of Harrisburg. But these districts do overlap, though. So municipal districts exist within the boundaries of national historic districts. So these are those are the municipal historic districts are regulated by the city of Harrisburg and the HARB. So like I was saying, some neighborhoods and buildings exist in both municipal and national historic districts. So primarily is what the residents of the city need to understand is that is the boundaries of a municipal historic district is what is the primary concern, because that's where the historic preservation program protects exterior alterations and changes in a historic district. And if anyone has questions or concerns, you can further contact me if you want to discuss further. And then the architectural conservation overlay districts are kind of like a historic district light, I guess, is the best way to put it. So a lot of the alterations in architectural conservation overlay districts are reviewed like municipal historic districts, but it's taken in consideration that that it's not a municipal historic district, and that it's different in how the context of those alterations are reviewed. So, so it's a little more lenient, I guess I could say.
So this is how I've come to understand what an ACOD is. You can basically do whatever you need to do to repair the home, except the facade of the home, and
Yep.
anything visible from the street
Yep.
must stay the way of the period.
Yep.
So, you can't come in here and build a geodesic dome. You can't come in here and put in a 7-story high rise, because that does not pertain to our area. So I'm pretty good with that. And I try to get people to understand it that way. And I show them the home that's on the corner of Walnut and Balm. When you walk past the front of it, there's a wonderful porch and a nice doorway, glass door. And as you're looking at the front of it, you would think that's the living room. That's actually a garage. You enter the home from the rear. There's a driveway that goes around to the rear. There's a garage area. That little alcove there is like an entryway, and the living areas are actually on the 2nd and 3rd floor. But when you look at it from the street, you would just think it's a regular 3-story home in the neighborhood. So that's how I'm real good with understanding that. I just didn't understand who's responsible for the national, if something in our historic district, and I'm not talking about for any of the historic districts here in Harrisburg, if something happens and it's also overlapping with this national register, who's responsible for repair or upkeep or guidelines? Or do you understand what I'm trying to ask?
Yeah, so the only effect that occurs in national historic districts is if there are federal or state funds that impact historic or cultural resources. So this is through the National Historic Preservation Act of 1966 through Section 106 process. That's a bit more complicated. I won't get too far into that, but overall, if alterations occur in a national historic district but are not in a municipal historic district, the city has no purview over that. A private citizen could tear down a building in a national historic district without going through HARB, given that it's not in a municipal historic district.
Whoa, that's interesting.
Yeah, so it's a common misconception that national historic districts are, protected like amber, and you can't tear stuff down and you can't make alterations, but that's not true. As long as it's just private funds and it's not federal or state funds, then that's when you get into the Section 106 review process and things like that. And that occurs even outside of national historic districts if there are historic or cultural or archaeological resources present. So that's a whole nother topic. And Loretta, if you want to give me a call, I could talk about that all day. So feel free to give me a call or shoot me an email. I could send you some resources.
I appreciate it. Thank you.
You're welcome.
All right, next we have David. Go ahead, David.
Hi there, it's David Morrison with Historic Harrisburg Association. I just wanted to add very briefly to that last conversation. The National Register of Historic Places, which some of you have probably heard of, individual buildings for a long time have been placed on that. And that's just to identify buildings that are historic. But the federal government is way too big to possibly regulate thousands and tens of thousands of properties, but they do identify them. It's an inventory.
Yeah.
And so in addition to individual properties, after a while, they realized that creating districts was a way to encompass a whole neighborhood at once, rather than having to nominate every single house in Midtown to the National Register of Historic Places. So, but it's not, and that's why we have municipal districts as well, because they can be regulated at the municipal level because it's a smaller geographic area.
Yeah.
So that's why we have both.
Thanks, David.
And I just want to say, good job, Frank. Wonderful presentation.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
All right. And yes, Councilwoman Bowers, please.
Thank you. I don't have any formal comments, just wanted to get on and say hello and thank you, Frank, for all of your hard work on this and for hosting. I know that I received a lot of engagement, so I'm hoping that people are viewing and paying attention to these updates. So thank you again for hosting. Just wanted to greet everyone.
Thank you.
The suspect investigators going on to say yesterday.
All right, does anyone else have any comments or questions? Please use the raise hand tool. All right, at this time, I don't see any comments or questions. I did put Frank's email address in the chat tool if you'd like to reach out to him.
If anybody, like Moment said, if anybody has any comments or questions, feel free to reach out to me. F.A. Grumbine, Grumbine at harrisburgpa.gov, or feel free to call my office at 717-255-3079. I'd love your comments or concerns about the document. And if you have any questions, I'm always open. So thanks for coming, and hopefully we'll see you next Thursday to finish a brief review of the second half of the new Historic District Design Guidelines. Thanks, everyone.